Hello and welcome to The Ukraine Shelf, a podcast hosted by the UCL European Institute, produced in collaboration with UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Ukrainian Institute London, supported by the British Academy. My name is William Blacker, Associate Professor in Ukrainian and East European Culture at UCL, and alongside me in the studio is my co-presenter and co-creator of the podcast, Olesia Khromaychuk, author, historian and director of the Ukrainian Institute London.
Hello. In each episode, we seek out the best books on Ukraine in English and also think about the books that should be translated from Ukrainian or other languages. And we talk to authors about their books and get their recommendations for books by others that we need in order to understand Ukraine and its place in the world.
Please do check out our previous podcasts on Crimea and also on Russian attempts historically and today to destroy Ukrainian identity and culture, which you can find via the UCL European Institute website or on the YouTube channels of the European Institute or the Ukrainian Institute London or on the various platforms that host the podcast, SoundCloud, Spotify and others. For this episode, we're really excited to be joined by two authors who've written brilliant books about Ukraine's east and specifically about the region we know as Donbas, and we'll talk about the name at the beginning of our conversation. This is, of course, where, alongside the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia's aggression against Ukraine began.
Eastern Ukraine and the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in particular have been a crucial flashpoint for Russia's war against Ukraine. And it was there that the war raged for 8 years, almost unnoticed by the world before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. These regions continue to be poorly understood outside of Ukraine even today. And that's why it's absolutely wonderful to have two writers with us today who can help us understand these places from the inside and to hear the voices of the people who live there, or at least lived there until recently.
Our first guest joining us from Kiev is Olena Stiazhkina, a historian and also one of Ukraine's most prominent prose writers. She comes from Donetsk, where she lived and worked at Donetsk University until 2015 when she was forced to flee the Russian invasion. Her historical work focuses on everyday life in the Soviet Union and also under Nazi occupation during World War II, and often focuses on the experiences of women. She's also written 11 books of prose and currently has 3 books available in English translation. They are 0 Point Ukraine, 4 essays on World War II, which is published by Ibidem. Also Ukraine, Love, War, a Donetsk diary, translated by Annie O. Fisher. And also the book that we will discuss today, Cecil the Lion Had to Die, translated by Dominique Hoffman. And both of these books, Ukraine, Love, War and Cecil the Lion Had to Die, are available, published by Harvard Library of Ukrainian Literature and Harvard University Press. And if you didn't catch these titles or the titles in any of the other episodes, don't worry, we have a full list of all the books that we discuss on the Ukraine Shelf webpage and in the episode descriptions on the various platforms.
And with us in London in the studio is our second guest, Victoria Donovan, who's Professor of Ukrainian and East European Studies and the Director of the Center for Global Post-Socialisms at the University of St. Andrews. Victoria's research explores entangled colonialisms and industrial extraction with a focus on Ukrainian East. Victoria is the author of a number of books, including Chronicles in Stone, Preservation, Patriotism and Identity in Northwest Russia. And she also co-authored a book with Daria Cymbaluk and others, which is called Limits of Collaboration, Art, Ethics and Donbas. And her most recent book is Life in Spite of Everything, Tales from the Ukrainian East, which has just been published by Daunt Books. And that's the book we'll be focusing on today. Welcome, Victoria. Welcome, Olena.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be with you.
And it's an honor to have you. Let us start from that term, Donbas. It's a complicated term. It's a problematic term. Victoria, may I turn to you to explain what it means and why we are hesitant to use it?
Yeah, thank you. Donbas is first and foremost a geological term. So it's a shortening of the geological description Donetsk coal basin, Donbas. And it's a term that was first used in the 1830s by industrial prospectors who were, on the invitation of the Tsarist government at that time, invited to today's eastern Ukraine to determine what was beneath the ground, what minerals were present in that region and which could be extracted for profit and benefit of various industrial elites. So first and foremost, the term is a geological one. And I think what's important to underline is that it marks the transformation of today's eastern Ukraine from a region that was relatively strategically unimportant from the point of view of the center of empire into an extraction resource. So it's the beginning of the history of eastern Ukraine as a site of really intense industrial extraction. So that's one thing that makes it problematic. The second thing is that in the Soviet era, it was a term that was really heavily mythologized. So Donbas was a region that was presented in Soviet propaganda as a kind of flagship of proletarian industrial modernity. Its miners and steel workers were celebrated as the proletarian heroes of the country and as celebrities and as models for overproduction that were supposed to be emulated and copied around the country. And, well, just to give you an idea, there's one very iconic poster from 1930 that shows Donbas as a beating heart, pumping its lifeblood in the form of coal all along the arterial railways of the Soviet Union from Vladivostok in the east to Riga in the north and Baku in the south. And this idea, I think, of Donbas as a kind of vital organ within this broader kind of industrial body of the Soviet Union is one that really kind of sticks and continues to kind of frame the cultural imagination of the region right up to the present day. And, Putin's Russia obviously thinks of Donbas still as this region that is an integral part of its own kind of political body. And then I think the third moment that's just worth mentioning is that after 2014, as you mentioned, when Russia started its war against Ukraine and annexed Crimea and started its military invasion of Donbas, it's a term that gets toxified by its association with the pro-Russian propaganda of terrorist fighting groups in the East and gets associated with this idea of kind of Russian propaganda and anti-Ukrainian hate. So I think for all of those reasons, it has a lot of baggage. It becomes a very heavy term, but it's nevertheless one that people continue to use who come from Eastern Ukraine. Sometimes, it can connote an idea of home, even more so today, an idea of a lost homeland. And so it's a term that has many different meanings and many different associations. It's a complicated term that has to be handled with care. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that explanation of the complexity of the term. Olena, you're from Donetsk. You're from that region. Do you use that term? How do you feel about it?
Yes, I'm from Donetsk, but I'm not from Danbas. I'm from Donetsk region, and it's different. And I totally agree with Victoria. Donbas is a word, a term, which used by Moscow Bolshevik authorities to create a showcase of socialism. And it's not a historical name of this region. It's not a self-name like Scotland or Alsace, for example. Historically, this territory was called the steppe with a capital letter. Until 18th century, it was the borderland between Moscow and the Crimean Khan, between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Moscow and the Turks. And in the Polish tradition, this territory was called the wild field. But it wasn't wild, really. It was inhabited by Ukrainian Cossacks who guarded the borders here. And later, when coal deposits were discovered, and on this basis, a geological map of Donetsk coal basin was created, and it's abbreviated to Donbas. And I totally agree with Victoria about the geological origin of this term. This term is not about people, it's not about history. It's about politics, I think. And this region in the 19th century was developed as America in days of the first colonists. Europeans came here and brought money and ideas with them. Europeans and Americans also. They created many industrial enterprises, built cities, and my native Donetsk was the child of a Welsh businessman, John Hughes. And Luhansk was founded by a Scotsman, Charles Gascoigne, as you know. And yes, the development of this region had a certain flavor of colonialism. But this flavor did not disappear when the Bolshevik came to this region. Bolshevik nationalized everything, and more precisely, they did not nationalize but stole enterprises, profits, history, names. And Bolshevik proclaimed everything their own achievement and called it Donbas, a model of socialist industrialization and creation of new Soviet man. There was no place for Ukrainians in this model. There was no place for Greeks who lived in the Azov Sea region, Poles, Germans, etc. There was no place for peasants who always spoke Ukrainian, no place for intellectuals, writers, poets, only for the Soviet Russian working class. And late in this century, the Kremlin tried to create another fake model, so-called the people of Donbas, a specific people who seem to have the right to independence. It was under this banner of the people of Donbas, or saving people of Donbas, that the Kremlin launched its invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And I understand that Donbas as a word is very convenient, but it's very dangerous. It's toxic because it does not clarify history and politics. It confuses and creates misconceptions. That is why I prefer to be from Donetsk region, to be from Donetsk, not from Donbas.
Okay, so a complicated word with a complicated history. And you mentioned, Olena, this connection actually to the UK and to Wales specifically and to John Hughes. So Donetsk, obviously formerly Józefka. And this is also something kind of personal to you, Victoria, because you also have a connection with that history and with Wales and with. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, Olena, I'm from Cardiff, which is just very close to Merthyr Tydfil, which is where John Hughes is from. And actually, I began working on this topic because I found out about an archive in Cardiff called the Hughesovka Research Archive that holds all of the documents of the Welsh labour migrants who went to today's Donetsk at the end of the 19th century kind of made lives for themselves and in some cases lived there for several decades. It's a really fascinating archive that of photos, letters, often written by women who accompanied the men who were the managers of the mines, and working documents, photographs of children, pictures of holiday trips that people took. And it got me really interested in this history of foreign capital investment in eastern Ukraine at the end of the 19th century. And as you say, that's also a complicated history because on the one hand, it's one that gets told quite romantically sometimes, as this history of these intrepid pioneers from Western Europe who went to Eastern Ukraine and founded these industrial enterprises on the steppe, bringing all of their resources and their expertise and their knowledge. But it's also a story of exploitation because they weren't there to better the lot of the local economies or to improve the conditions of local workforces. They were there to make a lot of money. It resonates a bit with the minerals deal that we're talking about a lot right now. Foreign capitalists were there in order to make their fortunes. In some cases, the working class Welsh people who went there with the intention of jumping several rungs up the social ladder to improve their own lots and to improve the lot of their family. So I think that episode is a really interesting one because it can be romanticized, and I think I'm interested to know how that story was told when you were growing up in Donetsk, because in Wales we don't know very much about this at all, but when the story does get told in newspapers, it's often told in this mode of the intrepid pioneers, and not really critically enough. It doesn't get into the whole sort of history of settler colonialist type practices. It's not colonialism, but it's a kind of sort of exploitative, extractivist approach to politics that at some level resembles colonialism. So yeah, I would also love to hear what it was like growing up in Donetsk and what stories were told about this history of Hughes and Hughesovka.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, maybe can you tell us, Olena, a little bit about when did you discover this history of John Hughes and the connections with Western Europe? Is it something that was well known to you growing up in the region?
It was a common knowledge in Donetsk about John Hughes, absolutely common knowledge. And at the very beginning of our years of regaining independence of Ukraine, in Donetsk, we built, not me, but our authority built a monument to John Hughes in the center of the city, and we knew it. And when Russian forces started to occupy our city in the spring of 2014, our guerrilla group started to organize a referendum, a controversial referendum about our reunion with the Great Britain, because our father founder was from the Great Britain. That is why we have a right to be a part of this country. Yes, it was funny, and it was a common memory. I mean, it's and we thought that we could overcome it, but we didn't really. But I have leaflets about this referendum of reunion with the Great Britain, and now we are proud of this idea.
And this story actually brings us very nicely to your novel, to Cecil the Lion Had to Die, because part of the novel deals precisely with this period of the occupation of 2014. So this is a novel written, it intertwines the story of several families, several children who were born on the same day in the same hospital in 1986 in Donetsk. And it follows the life stories of these children and these families, kind of looks at how the different choices that people made, the way they dealt with the various challenges and changes that happen in the region. And especially, this moment of 2014 is very important in the novel. But you also, what I think is really interesting about the novel is how you connect it to the longer history and to questions of memory, to questions of complicated identities, kind of all these kind of complicated questions. And I wanted to ask you about your approach to telling the story of the people of Donetsk, because you said, when we talked about Donbas, this is a term which is about politics and not people, and your books are about people, very much so, and kind of getting down to this level of who are the people who are on this, territory. We talk so often about Eastern Ukraine as territory, but there are people who have stories, and your work tells those stories in a really beautiful way. But I wanted to ask you about this choice of focusing on children born in 1986. So what's so important about that moment? Why focus on these children born precisely then? And also, this decision to use lots of different characters and tell lots of different stories which intersect in different ways, rather than just one character. So please, could you tell us about those decisions when you were writing the novel?
Thank you for this question. This is my first time answering such question, and maybe I have some answers. I think I have. I was blamed many times that there are many parallel stories are in the book, and it's difficult to read. And my proposal was and is okay. You can read one part, and that's all. And that's why different part from different pages. And then you can figure out something like puzzle, combine it, and maybe it will work. But really, the thing is that my central character is exactly Donetsk, not all these people, because Donetsk is not a gray zone, something dark and unpleasant, and it's not a point on the military map of military operation. And exactly, Donetsk is not a part of Kremlin myth. As you told, Donetsk is a people. Donetsk is a choice. It's about willingness to be, or maybe willingness not to be, and agreeing to fall asleep in the arms of strangers and enemies forever. My hero is Donetsk, and it has always been about growth, about creating a world in the steppe with capital S, and in the wild field, and about children who, despite everything, grew up here as Ukrainians. And as for the second part of your question, unfortunately, Ukraine manifests itself in the world mainly through the grief and disaster. In 1986, we were visible because of Chernobyl tragedy. Yeah? But despite everything, even in that black year for everyone, children were still born. And children are for life, not for death. At least that's how it seemed at the time. And perhaps that is why I chose 1986 as the year of birth of my main characters. It is a symbol, if you want, of eternal life, a life that can exist even in times of disaster. And now in Ukraine, despite everything, children are being born, and they are starting their story today when the Kremlin wants to kill them. But children still come to us. Perhaps it's about children's belief that the world of adults should become an adult and safe place. And it's about our new generation of Ukrainians. I mean, children born in late 80s and later is now the generation who fight against the enemy at the front and help as volunteers. And they are not necessarily ethnic Ukrainians, but political Ukrainians who chose to be Ukrainian. Maybe this is a central theme. My Donetsk has an opportunity to choose being, to choose to be Ukrainian, maybe something like that. That is why I promise my readers can start from every part of this book, whatever they want. It's normal. Or it's okay. It can be.
I mean, one thing you notice if you start from the beginning and read through to the end is that the novel in the original starts in one language and changes as we go through the novel into another language. It starts in mainly in Russian, and then towards the end it's mainly in Ukrainian. And it's a very unusual example of a novel which is written in two languages, and which expresses some of these questions that you've been discussing, this kind of choice to be Ukrainian, which is more a kind of political choice than a kind of choice to do with ethnicity. It expresses it through the very fabric of the language that's being used in the novel. And in the translation, the readers can get a sense of that, because the decision that the translators made was to publish, when it's in Russian, it's white text on black background, and when it's in Ukrainian, it's black text on white background. So the reader knows when the language is changing. But I want to ask you about this decision to write the novel in two languages. Can you tell us why you decided to do that?
Thank you. I would like to say, if we read in Russia, there are black pages. And if we read in Ukrainian, there are white pages. I think it's a good symbolic way for understand where good and where evil in this story. That is why I think it wasn't my decision, it was my discovery. It was Oleg Kotsuba who created this idea, and I love it really. Black for Russia and white for Ukraine in this war.
How about the original decision when you wrote it in Russian and Ukrainian?
I think I should probably say now, I know that you know, but for our viewers, or how to say, readers, I should probably say that I'm native Russian speaker, or rather I was Russian speaker. And significant number of my fiction texts were written in Russian. And this has never been a problem in Ukraine. The problem in Ukraine was the development of the Ukrainian language. This was the truth and was our reality. And my novel, its plot maybe, suggested itself in what language it wanted to be written. It happened at the moment of writing the episode about their frontline story. I wrote a few paragraphs and realized that I had done it in Ukrainian. But my first parts were already written in Russian. And this one seemed to be written in Ukrainian, even without my conscious participation. I realized then that I couldn't write about the war that Russia started in the language of enemy. And from this episode, language and language transition also became the characters in my book. And for my characters, the Ukrainian language is a choice to be free, or the way God intended them to be, or the way they intended themselves to be. One of my characters writes a letter in Russian, but asks to have it translated because for him too, the choice of language is a choice of freedom and presence in the world. And we have already discussed this point, but I would like to repeat it for our audience. The instructions for those who will provide first aid at the front line include a rule: address the wounded exclusively in Ukrainian. This is not about a ban or discrimination. It's about protection. It's about the simplest and most understandable assurance. You are at home, not in captivity, not in filtration camp, not in Russia torture chamber. You woke up where you should be, at home. The Ukrainian language means that everything will be fine. And that is why I should say many of us are returning, not switching, not transiting. We are returning. returning to our language. By rejecting Russian, it is as I am acquiring some secret powerful forces that have been put to sleep in me. By imperial colonial policy, yes, but also by my own stupidity, yeah. The whole world around me never stopped speaking Ukrainian, even my Russian speaking parents and friends. In the main and most important conversation, quarrels or confessions, or something about love, the real thing always came out in Ukrainian. And I know it. Now I recalled it, all this moment. And I would like to be the last generation of my family who can dream in the language of occupier. And from there, a fresh black joke was heard in the volunteer center. When I die, I will switch to Russian. Let there be one less Russian. I know it is cruel, yes, but it is what it is. As for me, I don't want to switch before I die. I would like to die as Ukrainian in Ukraine after our victory.
Indeed, Olena, thank you for sharing that story about the instruction to address people in first aid instruction to address people in Ukrainian as a symbol of safety. I repeat, I've heard that story shared by you before, and I repeat it to audiences wherever I speak when they ask me about the difference between being Russophone and pro-Russian, and somehow that story immediately answers the question. There are no more questions about that after that explanation of Ukrainian as a symbol of safety. I'd like to ask you about another book of yours, one of my favorites. It's called In God's Language. It is not yet translated into English. Only an extract is available, translated by OM, and it was published online in the journal Apophany, so you can find that extract there if you want to look for it. And if any translators or publishers are listening to us, there's a book waiting to be translated and published. Olena, that book, In God's Language, you wrote it in Russian. You published it in 2017. And all of this seems like, from another life. And yet, in order to understand the life that Ukrainians are living today, I think it's absolutely essential to read that book. It's a book about Russian occupation, the horrors that it brought to Eastern Ukraine. It's about languages that we've already touched on, identities. And just like in Cecil the Lion, it's also about the different choices the people from the same city made. Two men find themselves on the opposite sides of the war. And there's a passage about life under Russian occupation that I found really chilling at the time when I read the book, and I find it even more chilling today. Let me read it. It's only brief, and this is in OM's translation. That was one of the simple desires people now had, to be identified. Nobody was too picky about being put in a mass grave. To be identified is not to prolong another's suffering, not to force them to wait for you. End of quote. I know you're in touch with people who continue to live under Russian occupation in Donetsk. How do you relate to this text that you wrote before the full-scale invasion? How does it sound to you today?
It's really difficult question and difficult way of thinking. Sometimes I think that I don't want to return to this book. I love it, really. I am the best criticist to myself, and I'm very strong and strict with myself. But this book is ok, and their translation of Oyam is absolutely brilliant. And translated text is much better than much better than original, really. And I like it and I love it, yes. But sometimes I think that I'm frightened of it because this text, my text and translation of Uyam makes me vulnerable to this day. I feel I feel that I was wounded and my wounds are open. There in that book, my Donetsk is still alive. It has some hope. It has a lot of people who are ready to fight. I see the streets of my childhood, the bus stops, the names of my childhood, that as I thought I no longer remember. But I remember when I take this book, I remember it. And this book speaks to me now on its own. They have, it's maybe he's, I think it is a boy. And it has his own voice. And I realize that I love my city. I love it. I miss it, despite everything that has happened to it. And I want to return at least one day. But I want to return to my Ukrainian Donetsk, and sometimes I wonder if I will be able to survive to see it. Despite everything I believe, and for me now, this book is about great personal grief. And I think that I have right to this personal grief, maybe only this grief, because I know how many griefs now in our country. But also, this book for me is about hope. That is why I'm frightened of it and I love it.
Well, thank you so much for writing it and for sharing this personal grief with us. We really appreciate that vulnerability. Victoria, let me ask you something about switching from one language to another as well. Olena switched from Russian to Ukrainian in her work, but you've also switched languages to some degree. This book that we're discussing today, Life in Spite of Everything, started as a project that was meant to be an academic piece of work, but the academic project got shelved and you decided to write a non-fiction book. And it is also a book that is full of Ukrainian voices, full of people from the region talking to you about the region. And indeed, it has your voice in it as well, which is an unusual thing for a scholar to insert. Tell us about this decision to switch languages in your own way.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as you say, when the full-scale invasion started in February 2022, I was writing a very different book. I'd been researching the history and heritage of industrialization in Ukraine's east since about 2016. And I was writing quite an academic book, which was written, as you say, in a kind of more traditionally academic way with, well, for a start, I wasn't in it. It was written in a third-person voice. It had that sort of critical distance, that sort of sense of detachment that is usually expected of academic writing. And I had a couple of chapters of that written in February 2022. And then when the full-scale invasion started, I just found myself sort of paralyzed and unable to continue with that book and unable to access that detached academic voice. Because many of the places that I was writing about, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Bakhmut, Mariupol, which I'd just returned from in November 2021, they were being devastated and destroyed by Russian bombs right at the moment that I was writing this history. And it just seemed like a violence in itself to almost write with this detachment and this sense of abstraction. It's actually made me think a lot about the sort of violence of academic writing more generally, and what we do when we kind of abstract and kind of treat people and communities as quote unquote research subjects rather than real people. So I decided that I couldn't carry on with that. That's still on my laptop in a folder. And I started writing a very different book, which I was in. And I wanted to really kind of commit to paper to paint a portrait of this beautiful region that Olena's just been describing, that I'd travelled in, of the really dynamic cultural life that was present in that region up until 2022. Eastern Ukraine, when I was travelling around it, was already known as this hub of cultural activism. People wanted to go there. There was an amazing kind of underground culture that was really flourishing, huge rave scene, brilliant contemporary art. And I wanted to kind of paint a picture of that because that was all being displaced and destroyed. And I didn't think of it at the time as a kind of documentary initiative, but a couple of people have pointed out since that it has elements of kind of a kind of documentary or elegiac kind of text, and perhaps that's right.
Certainly your book, and I think Olena's books also, what they do is really to fight against the kind of stereotype of Eastern Ukraine and of Donetsk region or Luhansk region, the Donbas, whatever we want to call it. There is a certain stereotype that this is a place which is kind of lacking culture in some way. A place which is, it's about post-industrial decline. It's about, these kind of grey, decaying cityscapes. It's people who have a very sort of vague sense of their identity. Maybe they've lost their identity through, various historical processes. But actually, in both of your books, we see the picture of a region which is a place of culture, a place of activism, a place of energy, but also a place of very complicated and entangled identities. And this is one thing that appears in both books is, the fact that when we talk about Donbas, we can't just talk about the Ukrainian, the Russian elements, but we also can talk about the Greeks and the Germans and the Poles and the protagonist of In God's Language, which, by the way, is much better in the original, not in my translation, is from the Assyrian minority. So it's actually a real kind of melting pot region. And I want to ask both of you, if was that diversity and that complexity and that entangledness something that you wanted to emphasize? Maybe Victoria, can I ask you first?
Yeah, it certainly was. I mean, I think, it shows the power of Russian propaganda. The fact that, when many people think of this region, and even now when, I do talks, I always get asked, is this a pro-Russian region? Is this a Russian-speaking region? And the reality is very far from that. So this part of Ukraine was a contact zone in that sense that Marie Pratt talks about. It was at the intersection of various empires, and that history of inter-imperiality brings with it a very complex, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual reality. And if you add to that then industrialization, and this is the same for sort of industrialized regions across the world, industrialization is almost always accompanied by migration, waves of migration. So you have the ethnic and cultural complexity of this sort of entangled colonialism, and then you have the migration that industry brings. That makes for a very complex cultural and linguistic and ethnic landscape. And so that was something that surprised me, even though I knew the history, when I went to the region, and something that I really wanted to bring alive in the book. And you mentioned the Greeks. So this was something that I found out about in more detail when I was in Mariupol in November 2021, the fact that there was this sizable Azov Greek minority in Mariupol that had been displaced from Crimea in the late 1700s when Catherine II expanded the borders of the Russian Empire and moved peoples to resettle this land, which today's Donbas forms a part of. And so this Greek minority was still present in the city up until 2022 and had preserved many of their cultural traditions. They spoke Greek dialects, Urum and Rumeyka, and had many traditions, culinary traditions and cultural traditions that they were still observing. And then in 2022, with this brutal siege in Mariupol, they, like many other residents of the city, were displaced again or killed. And so the experience of the Azov Greeks in Mariupol was bookended by this colonial violence, and is a real kind of instructive story of how colonial violence is so devastating.
Absolutely, thank you. And Olena, can I turn to you with this question of the multicultural nature of this region?
I think that we know only one pity and cruel effort to realize an approach, one country, one nation. It is about Hitler, and it is about Nazi. And as for Ukraine and Ukrainians, I think we had never been um, in this approach. Our history is about multi-ethnicity from the very beginning, from the ancient times, when the nomad civilization met with peasant civilization, when Poles and Ukrainians, when Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians met on this territory. It's our history is about other choice, is about choice to be what do you want to be. We don't want to be a Russian because Russian Ukrainian means only Russian, but Ukrainian Jew means Ukrainian Jew, and Ukrainian Poles means Ukrainian Poles. That is why, for me and for my book, for our book, this Assyrian character is only way to show this, to show this complex way to make this choice. And only this one, because you know that this funny word Jewish Banderites was formed during revolution, and it's funny, but it's true. It's our real story, and I'm really proud of it. My family was multi ethnic. My stepfather was half Jew, Jewish, and half Greek, and he joked because my mother is Greek. In Israel, I am Greek, and because my father is Jew, in Israel, I am Greek also. That, that is why. That is why I know how it worked, and I know how it works now. And now, when I write something about these days, I don't ask people, what is your nation? What is your what is your ethnical origin? It's absolutely bullshit. It's nothing. Because I work with people. I work with their soul, their hands, their bodies, and their blood is red, and they died for Ukraine. They Poles and Ukrainians, they Jewish and Russians. They died for Ukraine. That is why. That is why uh, I will write about it again and again, because all this fake model from Kremlin propaganda about Ukrainian nationalist, it's absolutely bullshit. Ukrainian nationalism is to feel that all children in the basement, all children who killed and who survive now is ours. Only this formula, only this really. But I will write about it because I think that readers from abroad, from Europe, maybe need to read about it. But I think that for the Great Britain, the picture is the same.
Absolutely, and I agree that we readers abroad need to read about this region, and they need to read what you've written and what Victoria's written. But we also want to ask both of you which other books you would recommend. So this is something we do in each podcast. We ask our guests for a recommendation.
But now I highly recommend, no, I highly ask you to read this book. This book title is Looking at Women, Looking at War. The author of this book is Victoria Amelina, and I can't tell was about her. She was killed by Russian rockets together with other 12 persons in Kramatorsk. But for us, she's alive and she's laughing now. Maybe she's arguing, but she's laughing really. This book is excellent. And in the foreword of this book, Margaret Atwood has written, in any religion, there are the recording angels, the spirits, which job to write down all goods and evils of humans. And I'm sure that our Victoria Amelina is the recording angel. And when you read this book, you can feel it. You can feel yourself hugged and maybe kissed, and you feel stronger. And please read it.
Olena, thank you so much for recommending that book. We were privileged to host Sasha Dozhik, one of the editors of Victoria's unfinished book, Looking at Women, Looking at War, in our previous podcast. So it's just a reminder to all of our listeners to check out the previous podcast, because Looking at Women, Looking at War by Victoria Amelina is featured there, and we discuss it at great length. Victoria, what is your recommendation for our listeners?
Oh, I have very many recommendations as well. Well, I'd like to mention one book which was so important for me when writing my own book, which hasn't been translated. It's Pracja, Wysnażenie ta Uspich, Promysłowy monomista Donbasu, Labour, and this is an approximate translation, Labour, Exhaustion and Success, Company Towns of the Donbas, which was, it's an edited collection of essays about the history of Donbas company towns through the 19th and 20th century, that was edited by Volodymyr Kulikov and Irina Sklokina, and is an excellent kind of historical overview. And I think, it also deserves to be translated, so I hope it will find its translator soon. In terms of fiction, one of my favourite writers is Yevgenia Belarusets, and her Счастливее Падение is, I think, a really great book that is translated, Lucky Breaks. It was translated by Eugene Ostashevsky, and that's a beautiful kind of collection of almost fairy tale-like stories infused with dark humour and magic realism that tells the stories of mostly women who've been impacted by the war since 2014. And then one last recommendation, if I may, is a trilogy of books by Vitaly Matukhno, who's an artist from Lysychansk, who since 2022 has published an incredible compilation of testimonials and artwork of artists from the from the Luhansk and Donetsk regions who have been displaced. And it's just an incredible documentary project that shows this diversity of cultural life in eastern Ukraine up until the full-scale invasion. And maybe I'll just include the titles of Vitaly's books that in the notes to this show. But Garaleya Nyata Dryosh was his kind of NGO organization, and they've published those books together, and they're just quite remarkable. And some of them are available online as well, so I would really highly recommend looking at those.
Fantastic. Just a reminder to our listeners that all of the titles of the books that we mentioned in this episode, you can find them in the description to the episode. Olena, Victoria, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your books, and thank you for your recommendations.
And we hope that you've enjoyed our conversation. And once again, remember there are 2 other episodes available at the moment, and there are more to come, so check those out.
Please spread the word about this podcast, available on a variety of streaming platforms, and keep an eye out for future episodes. And most importantly, keep reading about Ukraine. Slava Ukraini!